So welcome back to Chapter 5, Part 2. So this is Chapter 5, Part 2. We're continuing with the measurement chapter. Last time we talked about different kinds of measurements, self-report, observational, and physiological. We talked about the different kinds of data that we get, nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. We talked about how to chunk those into either categorical or quantitative. That means the same thing as continuous. We also talked about construct validity and its subsections, face validity, content validity, and criterion validity. Today, we are going to talk a little bit more about this idea of construct validity and what it has to do with two things called convergent and discriminant validity, and then we'll do some other information from there. So, convergent validity. Remember, when we're talking about these kind of data, what we're saying is I've got this one measure. So, let's say that I have the measurement of love from 17.com. Okay, so let me get rid of that because it's being weird. Come back. There we go. So we're going to talk about discriminant validity as well. So let's talk about this. So I have love as my conceptual variable. And the measurement that I want to test to see if it is construct valid is the 17 quiz. Now we've already talked about face validity, content validity, and criterion validity. Convergent validity and discriminant validity have to do with other measurements that are already out there. Other measurements that are already out there. So let's say that we know that there's another measurement out there, which is a measurement of, let's say it's vulnerability. Okay, so let's say that somebody has made what's a measurement, they call it the V scale. It measures vulnerability. And let's say that we have a separate measure over here, which has to do with, let's say it's conservatism. So whether you're politically conservative or not, and we'll call that the C scale. All right. Convergent validity has to do with, does the responses to our scale correlate with things that it should correlate with? So let's say that we have a good reason to believe that if you're in love, that you're also more vulnerable. That is, you're more emotionally vulnerable. What we're saying is that we think that vulnerability and love are correlated, that these go back and forth. They correlate with each other. Convergent validity would be if the measurement correlates with what it should correlate with. So remember, 17 quiz, that's the thing that we're measuring. That's the measurement. This is the measurement that we want to test right here. Convergent validity says that this measurement, the 17 quiz, should also correlate with things that it should correlate with. So if love correlates with vulnerability, then the 17 quiz, if it's a good measurement of love, should correlate with the V scale, which is already determined to be a good measurement of vulnerability. Convergent validity is the measurement correlates with with a measurement that it should correlate with, right? The measurement correlates with the measurement of concept that is correlated to the concept that the measure measures. Discriminant validity goes the other way. Let's say that we have good evidence that love and conservatism aren't correlated. And conservatives love people, liberals love people. That doesn't have anything to do with it. So when we look at these, we think there's no correlation. They shouldn't have any correlation. They should be totally independent from each other. Well, discriminant validity would say that the measurement of those two concepts then should have nothing to do with each other either. That's discriminant validity. So here's what happens in real life. Psychologists come up with measurements of concepts like the 17 quiz. And before they just throw them up there on the internet, they actually go through a lot of steps to test and check the validity of their measurement. And one of the things that they do is they have the same people take their new measure. So let's say that we were doing this correctly for 17.com. What we would do is we would say, before we're going to publish to the world, let's have a bunch of people take our 17 quiz and the vulnerability V scale and the conservative C scale. The same people take all three scales. We have good convergent validity if our 17 quiz does correlate with the V scale, but does not correlate with the C scale. We have good convergent validity if the 17 quiz does correlate with the measurement of vulnerability, like it should conceptually, and it doesn't correlate with the C scale, the measure of conservatism, which shouldn't correlate conceptually. That's convergent validity and discriminant validity. Correlation, if you remember, positive, negative, and no correlation. This is something we reviewed, I think in chapter 2, if I'm not mistaken. So correlation just means as one goes up, the other goes up. So positive correlation means as vulnerability goes up, your love scale goes up. That would be positive correlation. Now, convergent validity wants to find a correlation. It doesn't care if it's a positive correlation or a negative correlation, except for conceptually. So for example, if I think that as love goes up, vulnerability goes up, then I'd look for a positive correlation. However, I think that love should be correlated with depression, but in a negative way. That is, the more love you have in your life, the less depressed you are, right? Then in that case, I would be good convergent validity would show a negative correlation. So if you have a positive correlation or a negative correlation with your with the measure that you're testing, then you could have convergent validity as long as it's going the right way. Discriminant validity, you want no correlation at all. You don't want it to be negative. You don't want it to be positive. You don't want it to be anything. So if religious ideation has nothing to do with the amount you love somebody, then you don't want it to be positive and you don't want it to be negative. You want it to be nothing, right? You want there to be no correlation. Okay. In the last lecture that we did, we talked about this inclusion of the other in the self scale. There is another scale that's out there called the Rubin's love scale. So remember, the inclusion of the other in the self scale, these overlapping circles, that has to do with relationship closeness. There's another scale that's been established called the Rubin's love scale. So if I have the same people take the inclusion of the other in the self scale and the Rubin's love scale, what would I be looking for? I would be looking for convergent validity, because relationship closeness should be the more close, the more love, right? The higher you get on relationship closeness, the higher you get on the love scale. They should have convergent validity. They should go together. Okay, the inclusion of the other in the self scale and the Stanford-Binet IQ test. So I have the same people take the IOS, the inclusion of the other in the self scale right here, and an IQ test. What would I expect? What would I be testing? I would be testing discriminant validity, as long as I believe that IQ has nothing to do with relationship closeness. So let's assume that that's the case. And if that's the case, then an IQ test and a closeness test, they shouldn't have anything to do with each other, right? You can be close to someone, doesn't matter what your IQ is, right? They shouldn't affect each other at all. That would be discriminant validity. What about if the inclusion of the other in the self scale and a neuroticism scale? So the same people take the inclusion of the other in the self scale and a neuroticism scale. What would I be testing here? This depends on what our belief is. If we think that conceptually they have nothing to do with each other, neuroticism and closeness, then it would be discriminant validity. But I personally think that it would be convergent validity, because I think the closer you are, the less neurotic you would be. Okay? the closeness and neuroticism. The more close you are, the less neuroticism. That would be convergent validity because you remember, I don't care if they're correlated positive or negatively as long as it's in the correct direction for it. So it would show good convergent validity if the higher score on the inclusion of the other in the self scale had lower scores on the neuroticism scale. It would show a negative correlation, but it would still be convergent validity because it's still correlated. Just happens to be in a negative direction. Okay, what we're going to do now is we are going to do another measure. We're going to take Oprah's happiness quiz. Let's see if I can get this to work for me. All right, Oprah. Let's find you. So we're going to take Oprah's happiness quiz. Come on, Oprah, did that work? There we go. We're going to take Oprah's happiness quiz. This is a happiness test. All right. So the conceptual variable that it's attempting to measure is happiness. So what we see is it's going to give us certain what we call items. So each question is an item. But notice how it's not a question because it doesn't have a question mark, right? Each one of these separate things is an item. And then at the end, it's going to give us a score. So let's go ahead and say mostly true and mostly true, mostly true. I choose, okay, fine. And mostly true, and then mostly true. And I'm just answering here, and yeah, and mostly true. Okay, when I submit this, it takes all of those and adds them together and gives me a score of 80 in this particular case. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at our slides.